Good morning. My name's Ken Worpole. I'm here talking about writer Colin Ward, a very famous anarchist who centenary we're celebrating this year. He was born in 1924. And literally published today is his book, a collection of 18 essays by fans of Colin, ranging from psychologists to architects to planners to child psychologists and many others, because he had an enormous influence across a very wide range of topics. And I'm joined very happily by Gillian Darley, my right, the architectural historian, David Knight on my left, who's the architect and in whose beautiful news office we're sitting now. And we're going to really just speak, up to 20 minutes maybe, just about the importance of Colin Ward and why, really, in many ways, his influence is now greater than it was even during his lifetime. Now, I met Colin in 1974, and I have a very clear memory of that because I was still then a teacher. And I met him because he came to give a talk at the ILIA, in the London Education Authority, Urban Studies Centre in Islington. Now, very important is that the way that ILIA decided at the end of the 1960s that most secondary schools had no understanding of the changes happening in so many of the inner boroughs, and that really urban studies should become a part of the curriculum. In fact, Colin was very instrumental in this, although that's where I met him, because in 1973 he published a book called Living Street Work with Tony Fies. They were both working at the Town and Country Planning Association. And I think that's always an enigma many people think of, that an anarchist should make his name working for planning organisations, but it would happen to be a very creative. And Living Street Work was really about how children could learn to explore the environment they lived in, town hall, the parks, the public utilities, the libraries, get to know how actually really urban society works, both in terms of the interrelationships between people, but also the massive kind of public social infrastructure that supported everyday life. And this Living Street Work was very influential. They then set up a bulletin, which is called the Bulletin of Environmental Education, and the acronym was B. And the story is, and I don't know if this is true, that when they printed the copies, and I think they initially did 10,000 copies to send to every secondary school in England and Wales. Who would they send it to? So they decided they would send it to the head of environmental studies, of which, of course, none existed. and that kind of galvanized schools to they haven't got this kind of bulletin that they had sent to, what they're going to do with it, because it seemed to have a lot of very important ideas about curriculum change there, but who was going to do it? And that really did kind of create this momentum for the study of the local environment in the UK, really. And having met him in 1974, I became, a good friend of his. I followed his work, which I held slightly confused because the next important book was The Child in the City, published in 1978. But I would say that book has been read all over the world. It has had an enormous influence all over the world, literally, on understanding the key role that the child has in a way becoming the kind of thermometer or the canary in the coal mine of the degree to which a city or a place or a village or a town is actually accessible to everybody if it's child friendly. And so those things, I think, before handing over to Gillian, it's that notion that he did kind of was pessimistic towards the end, that he thought the car had finally won over the child in the 60s. But when we step back today and where we're looking now, and I've just cycled down here from the other side of Hackney through a number of local traffic networks, and the idea of 15-minute cities very much being explored in Hackney. So I've cycled through again, a part of London that is now thinking once again about the importance of a child-friendly city and the publicly accessible local neighbourhood. So, yeah, I mean, I'll show it to you again just to make sure you see it. But this is a book I think, that everybody should read.
Well, it's interesting that the dates fit so neatly, because I think I must have met Colin in 2 years after Cambridge. I produced a book, and actually photographed a book called Villages of Vision, which came out in 1975. And I had arrived at the Architecture Press, I don't remember by what route, and I suppose they had to put it to someone as to whether this was going to be a viable project. And I now realise, when I was writing my entry for this, I had a light bulb moment, because I realised it must have been that Godfrey Gilson, who was the publisher at the Architecture Press, his wife was a photographer in Child in the City. And I think that that must have been one or two or three of those people must have been approached to see whether, this kid from God knows where, with her idea, which had a lot of resonances, certainly, given that I dealt with all kinds of community ventures and utopian experiments and so on. So, and then in fact, the TCPA said, would I join the executive? So, and I used to go for 2 or 3 years, I think. Then there, of course, was Colin, the real man, who I hadn't, I've only just sort of had him in the shadows. He was obviously much more so.
Once met, never forgot.
Absolutely. And then, from then on in, I get these cards or little notes, and he was kind of an extraordinary, the word now would be networker, but he was very far from that. He was sort of an encourager. I think of him as a mentor, even though I was, only on one side of things. But, when I read his essays about allotments, I read his essays about Child in the City or Country, his book on new towns, it all weaves together. And that was the wonder of him, I think. But nothing that he did was not in sort of, it was all consonant, one to the next. All these different strands were symphonic.
Hey, well, my turn. I usually, increasingly feel old at these sorts of conversations, and now I feel young because I wasn't alive when we met Colin. And in fact, I never met him. So I did attend his kind of memorial event shortly after he died. My first encounter with Colin was not a personal one, but it was through his book with Dennis Harvey, Arcadia for All. And the reason that landed on me was not because of any kind of thematic interest as such at that point, but was because I was born and brought up in Shoreham by Sea.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and of course, well, maybe not of course, Shoreham, or rather the bungalow town bit of Shoreham, was a significant case study in the book Arcadia for All. Arcadia for All was a study, I think, undertaken in the late 70s, published in the early 80s, maybe, that sort of time, into the kind of plotland condition, particularly in the UK, but with reference to international versions of that, which was a kind of social movement, if you like, although not a coordinated one, of typically kind of working class purchasing of agricultural land, low value agricultural land in places like the Sussex coast and the Essex kind of hinterlands, to make settlements characterised by railway carriage homes and kind of not just do it yourself, but build it yourself, and all that sort of thing. And so the place that I was born had been one of the most extraordinary examples of that kind of incredible social condition. And my interest in that was triggered just as a kind of local history geek, as a 12-year-old, basically, and finding that fascinating. It wasn't just a place to live, it was also a very early natural light film studio. There's a huge greenhouse built to make films in. And then you've got kind of, you know, bodybuilders and musical stars and the other kind of, you know, the dregs of East London turning up in my hometown. And this was all, you know, many decades before I was there. And the fascinating thing to me, before really my kind of political or sort of social or architectural conscience existed really, was that none of this was visible. It had all been cleared away by the kind of local authorities in the late 1940s, using a very early instance of compulsory purchase, thanks to the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, to kind of clear away this whole settlement in the wake of wartime and rebuild it under, I think the phrase was conventional lines. And conventional lines is very much what it was. What you've now got on that same territory is a perfectly nice but very conventional suburb, and only a very small number of railway carriage homes surviving, none of them protected, which is a tragedy, and a little bit of that foundational spirit surviving in some houseboats on the edge of the land there. So I was fascinated by the fact that all this stuff was there, and I can remember trips with my parents trying to find relics of these railway carriages and bits of the film industry gone, but railway carriages at that point were still there in multiples. And I couldn't understand why this had possibly been wiped out. How did that go? Why would you do that? What on earth? You know, there were wonderful exhibitions about it in the local museum, the Marley pins and all these things. And the person that explained to me why that all had to go, not that he would believe it did have to go, but the person that explained that to me was Colin. Do Arcadia for all. That's my dog arriving in the room, just spirit of Anarchy. The book is incredibly fair and even-handed about this. I think we won't be in much doubt as to what side of the fence Colin was on in terms of the kind of battle between the emergent and self-built forces of that community and the kind of the more bureaucratic forces that sought to tidy it up after World War II. Colin would obviously certainly be on the side of the former. That's the Architect's Journal arriving. Amazingly. But the book doesn't just kind of tub bump that. It kind of analyzes the forces of authority, the forces of bureaucracy, traces the origins of those ideas, why it was felt necessary to sort of tidy up this mess of the settlement. And then he and Hardy also explore the ideas, opinions, hopes and dreams of the people that made that settlement in the first place. Many of them not well off, many of them kind of because of, you know, gender identity or all sorts of other things, not very at home in the established city or established town. And I think, without being too grand about it, that was the kind of foundation of my sense, the kind of the forces that are at play when we make towns, cities, and places. Generally, there's always a push and pull between order and authority, and the opposites of those things. And yeah, so I kind of credit him with sort of translating youthful geekery into something that actually feels of use, not just to me, but to students and other practitioners. When you think about making cities, what the limits of the profession, and how it might relate much better than it typically does to popular desire, popular activity.
I mean, he was very lucky in that he arrived his ideas arrived on the scene at the same time as New Society, in 1971. The New Society, I think, still much missed. I mean, it was a magazine of social affairs, very much rooted in everyday experience. And he was he would pay to go and, you know, travel all small places of Britain, talking to musical groups, choirs, wherever people were doing something for themselves. Yeah. And then he went to the New Statesman. I think he wrote 400 columns for the New Statesman. So he had this tremendous range of kind of experience. He wasn't sitting in an office thinking about what anarchism really meant. He was always out saying, what do we learn from these things? And and the other thing always struck me that when he did this talk, first of all, I heard him give at the Elite Centre, he wrote it down. He never influenced people. He was so suspicious of political rhetoric, people being grandstanding and kind of washing over with all kinds of, hypnotic phrases or whatever, trying to spell down the audience. That he wrote every talk he ever gave, which also accounts for the reason why there are so many books about it. Because a lot of those essays were collected, talking architecture, talking green, talking, talking
Workplace.
And it was just, as Gillian said, I mean, he had this kind of personal touch.
Well, in the essay I particularly noticed in Newtown, Hometown, which was both a television program, which you can find, it's easily catchable, the right word is.
Via legal means. Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
But the way in which he looks at 4 different Newtowns, wildly different geographically, and therefore the makeup of the residents, and the way in which he actually takes that absolute understanding of where he is to how he talks to the people. No, it's kind of scientific, but it's in its presentation, it's just entirely empathetic, because he's talking to people in the north who have been in the industrial areas and so on, and whose expectations of what a Newtown might be would be very, very different from people in the southeast. And all that understanding is sort of implicit in the questions he asks and how he deals with it, apart from the fact that he was in person the least, he was just kind of gentlest person. So he could never have frightened anybody. He could have come to a front door in Harlow or Basildon and asked people, very piercing questions had he chosen. And they wouldn't have been, at all offended. He just had that. He had that ability to just enter somebody else's setting. So I'm going to say that very well. Cut me.
But he didn't. I mean, I suppose the question then everybody said, well, why is he still regarded as an anarchist? Because there are many different theories about it. But it was very much simply about people themselves organising things and doing it from below. He was very, very suspicious, and I think in some occasions he was wrong. I mean, he was very against public council, but he thought local government shouldn't. He thought it should be run otherwise, neutral, associated or whatever. Very sceptical about local government, and the same as for transport. But and in even the new towns that he did have some reservations about kind of uniforms, but he was always that kind of to change his mind.
And he was always reading and reading and reading. And we can all point at people who are in print who just cite something they just read as a kind of terribly well read. But Colin, it just oozes out. Every page, everything he wrote has got a sort of appropriate hook from somebody else who might have said it with more background or more experience or more academic take on it, but feeding into the conclusions that he was drawing. And I just love this phrase that he used. He claimed that it was in his time at Shepherd Epstein, and he was actually in an architectural office, albeit not an architect, that he was introduced to Martin, particularly Martin Buber. And the idea that there was this immense tension between social principle and political principle, and that would only be resolved by autonomy, which is another word in his lexicon for anarchism. And that's when I suddenly realised what he meant by anarchism.
That's right, yeah.
I think you say that his research was sort of done on foot, like it's a lived research, not a desk research.
The barefoot research.
Yeah, absolutely, which is what he advocated for in the education work, of course. I guess to add to that thing about anarchy, I think he just thought anarchy was sort of there in human behaviour when it's allowed to be expressed. So for him, it wasn't an abstract political philosophy or a kind of millennial end game. Let's reach to this in a kind of revolutionary moment or something. Although he wouldn't have minded, but it was much more inherent in human behaviour. I think so. I think the kind of the lived research mode is about just going out until you find it, which is how he was able to find it in allotment associations, in the holiday camp movement, in all of these quite, in a way, unrelated conditions. He just kept on looking until he found evidence of those things. Famously, he would repeatedly cite the Lifeboat Association building on the work of Kropotkin as a thing that isn't about centralised power, but is incredibly effective as an emergency method. So I think that's why I'm always a bit suspicious of this very gentle anarchist around with him, because I think he was a fundamentalist anarchist in a way, but he saw it as being latent in human behaviour when it's given the chance to flourish. So yeah, I think that's really, really important. His anarchy was quite profound and quite deep, but it wasn't abstract.
And I think also that I may have made this up, but I think at some point he said, or someone's supposed to be saying that 80% of what we want is already here.
Yeah.
People do cooperate in every day of their lives. They're all helping each other. They trust each other. If you trust a bus driver to be safe, and you trust, we live in networks of kind of rights and responsibilities that are always active.
Yes.
And all he was doing was bringing them to the surface. And occasionally showing how they could be warped or faulted by higher forms of organisation. Yeah, exactly. Which is, I guess, is how you end up with him at the TCPA. Yeah.
And these sorts of ostensibly quite weird overlappings, and with him being an anarchist planner, in that he didn't want an abolition of planning. He wanted a better and more agile and more responsive planning that would enable things to happen. It wasn't the absence of the profession on any kind of complete level. It was much more about methods of practice that would enable rather than just define.
But the TCPA was far away from the RTPI.
Yeah.
And so actually talking about an organisation, as a charity, but essentially it's a kind of a pressure group based on the idea that I was born in the sort of founding fathers of the group.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to put a word in really for the remarkable people who have put in before us. And let's raise our hats to Ross Bradshaw.
Yeah.
5 Leaves, who has published him over and over again.
Yeah.
And the fact that Colin Ward, has been of interest to all sorts of organisations, Bristol Ideas, sadly no more, but the other component of this book is Andrew Kelly's many years of bringing these things to people. And then, with the book about Newtowns as well, for banking money.
Yes.
And, he was actually somebody who, it would be terrible to say, having said pair of hands, it's so damning, isn't it? But he was actually somebody that people would trust with a topic if it was something that was actually going out under a charitable organisation's aegis. So there's that sort of, I suppose you could say he was fortunate they were there and they were doing it, or where are they now? But the architecture, there's the Architecture Foundation. We should.
Yes, that's a good thing to thank the Architecture Foundation, Edison, for his colleagues for bringing this together. And it will be there, obviously, on Architecture Book Day. And the last thing is kind of waspish sense of humour. He must have known, because in 78, he did a book on art and the built environment. And I'll remember who he co-wrote it within a minute. It's too late now. But it was called The Exploding School. And I think for an anarchist, said the walls have got to come down. That was very good. But thanks to Gillian and David. And we look forward to seeing other people around this book.